Okie dokie. Conquest and Genocide. We do not propose to expend large sums of money to give them food from the first day of the year to the last. We must give them enough to keep them alive, but the Indians must, under the regulations that have been sanctioned by Parliament, go to the reservations and cultivate their land. If, by accident, an Indian should starve, it is not the fault of the government. Sir Hector Louis Langevin, MP, House of Commons, April 15th, 1886. Throughout 2017, Canadians were encouraged to participate in a year-long celebration of Canada's 150th birthday. Many people enjoyed the various festivities, from fireworks to concerts to totem pole carving, without giving much thought to what it meant, but the party did not go off without a hitch. For a state spending $200 million to build its brand, Canada's celebration was awkwardly timed. Indigenous political activism was growing, and awareness of Canada's heritage of colonial violence was more widespread following the release of the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Canada's use of residential schools against Indigenous children. The problem was that, for the party to make any sense, Canadians had to think about 1867, the year of Confederation. But under any scrutiny, the dynamics of that moment are heavily shaped by racism and colonialism. How could we talk about Confederation without mentioning the conquest of the Indigenous West and the passing of the Indian Act? These were foundational elements of Confederation, reflecting both the inheritance and the completion of colonial genocide. Some party. The Canada 150 celebration did, however, hit upon one fundamental truth. The Canada we know is a product of the dynamics of 1867. The moment of Confederation was the maturation of the settler colonialism that preceded it, the logical conclusion of the French and British occupation of this land. It was, by extension, the formative moment for what is now Canada, the point from which all modern Canadian history flows. While some of the 2017 celebrants fully ignored the painful legacy of Confederation, reimagining it as little more than a gallant and glorious exercise in nation building, many others tried to use the moment as an opportunity to reflect on how far Canada has come. While this latter group was willing to concede that 1867 was a key turning point in the genocide of the Indigenous peoples, they sought to reassure themselves that 21st century Canada was different and better than that. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reflected that position. As we mark Canada 150, we also recognize that for many, today is not an occasion for celebration. Indigenous peoples in this country have faced oppression for centuries. As a society, we must acknowledge and apologize for past wrongs and chart a path forward for the next 150 years, one in which we continue to build our nation-to-nation Inuit crown and government-to-government relationship with the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation. Our efforts towards reconciliation reflect a deep Canadian tradition, the belief that better is always possible. It sounded good, but what Trudeau and so many others ignored was the fact that the Canadian tradition they were celebrating would not exist without the darkest legacies of 1867. Even the idea that we should be concerned only about the legacy of 1867, rather than its ongoing manifestations, was sharply criticized by scholars like Glenn Sean Coulthard. 1867 is not simply a painful memory. Its entire logical framework remains written into the DNA of contemporary Canada. This is true not only of Canada's contemporary relations with Indigenous nations, which I take up in Chapter 3, but also in the rest of Canada's foreign policy. Thus, it is imperative that we properly understand the dynamics around this formative moment in the making of Canada. Typically, discussion about Confederation focuses on internal Canadian politics and the relations between Canada, Britain, and the United States, and I address those dynamics. However, the heart of the Canadian Confederation project was the conquest of the West. As such, my emphasis is on Canada's relations with the Indigenous nations of the Great Plains. In those formative relations, Canada was again encountering foreign powers, not dealing with an internal matter, and Canada's relationship with those foreign Indigenous nations was governed by the needs of a settler capitalist state and the ideology of white supremacy that lurks at the heart of colonialism. The Roots of Confederation. The Confederation of Canada had plenty of moving parts and motivations. There was frustration over political deadlock between Ontario and Quebec, and a desire to reorganize to facilitate functional governance. There was a dissatisfaction with the slower industrial development of Canada as compared to the United States. Pardon me. There were concerns that British imperial favor, with respect to trade and finance, was on the decline, leaving the nascent Canadian capitalist class to its own devices. This had already prompted some of the Canadian business elite to make a push for annexation by the United States in 1849. Indeed, chief among the factors that spurred Confederation was the awareness that the United States was expanding and that, if Canada was going to continue to be a viable national project of settler capitalism, it was going to have to unite in the East and expand to the West. In addition to the annexationist push, there was concern about American authorities disrespecting territorial boundaries, both in their wars against the indigenous peoples in the West and in border area battles in the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. There was also a growing sense, especially after a tense standoff over American boarding of the British mail vessel Trent, that British appetite to send troops to protect the Canadian territories was limited. From the standpoint of the Canadian elite, the Civil War had illustrated the fragility of the 19th century continental arrangements, a fact already apparent in Canada given the settler rebellions in the 1830s. Nevertheless, the victory and consolidation of the North had served notice that the American machine would not easily be stopped. Already, by the middle of the 19th century, American adventurers, traders, and would-be conquerors had moved north into what was then claimed as territory of the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, from contemporary Winnipeg to the Rocky Mountains. Given the aggressive expansion of the United States in the early 19th century, from the Louisiana Purchase to the Mexican-American War, it was not unreasonable to think that the Americans might try to consolidate their hold over the northern plains, cutting off the Canadian colonies from British Columbia, and thus limiting the expansion of Canadian settler capitalism. This competition between different factions of European colonizers, then, was at the center of the push for Confederation. Nevertheless, viewing Confederation as being motivated by rivalry with the US somewhat obscures the deeper motivation behind this rivalry. The race to settle the West wasn't simply a matter of abstract nationalism. It was about settlement. The Industrial Revolution was well underway in Europe, and the rapid transformation of the European peasantries into urban working classes, especially in Great Britain, was producing a dramatic new impetus for emigration across the Atlantic. With capitalism entering a period of rapid growth, it was becoming increasingly clear that territorial expansion was going to be a matter of paramount importance. New urban centers in Europe and North America would need to be fed, their factories would need raw materials, and their unemployed would need a migratory release valve lest they become restive and revolutionary, as they had dramatically in Europe in the 1840s. The Canadian elite saw the West as a profitable solution to these problems. No one better illustrates this than Canada's most famous Confederator, John A. Macdonald. Macdonald's family had immigrated to Kingston when John was 5 years old, and he grew up in comfortable middle-class conditions with an ambition for law and politics. Macdonald's legal practice was increasingly oriented to the corporate sector, and by the 1840s he was dabbling in property ownership himself. By the time he first ran for office, he recognized that in an emerging capitalist state, the role of politics was to support capital, a point first made by his countryman Adam Smith 100 years earlier. As James Laxer described him, Macdonald was close to the business community and anxious to promote its success, and did not see a separation between the interests of business and the role of the state. Indeed, the wealthy middle classes of Ontario and Quebec had agreed on little about the management of British North America, BNA, but recognized that they had a shared economic interest in colonial expansion. The government had sunk huge amounts of subsidy money into the Grand Trunk Railroad, but it was faltering under poor management and inadequate demand. Expansion to the west, to carry settlers west and bring agricultural products east, would be a boon to the railroad, and, like Macdonald, most politicians had these interests as a priority, though some criticized the fact that Confederation seemed to be a scheme drawn up by the Grand Trunk. While they bickered over the details, each of the signees of the British North America Act, which made official the creation of the Dominion of Canada, saw their economic fate tied to the expansion of east-west trade, and thus viewed the project of settling the West as urgent. I'm always curious. I'm always curious to hear from American comrades when they learn about how Canada was formed by basically signing paperwork, as opposed to like a war against the British. I'm always curious what my American comrades think of that. Because yeah, Canada was just founded by sitting down and signing some papers. Few different times. And well, you know, all this other stuff, but which we're getting into, but yeah, the British North America Act, Confederation Act, British North America Act. Alas, from the standpoint of the colonizers, there was one major impediment to settling the West. It was already settled. Indigenous nations living west of the Red River Colony, modern Winnipeg, had by no means been conquered. While the presence of the HBC had reshaped indigenous societies around their commercial relations, especially the fur trade, it had not established permanent agricultural settlements in the West, and, as such, indigenous control over the territory remained intact. By extension, many of the core dynamics of indigenous life and society remained indigenous. That is not to say that indigenous culture had remained static, nor that it was unaffected by many generations of contact with Europeans. Certainly, life on the prairies had already gone through massive changes prior to the 19th century. The introduction of horses and gunpowder had changed the nature of the buffalo hunt. The spread of European pathogens like smallpox and later tuberculosis had ravaged many communities. The migrations and movements that flowed from struggles with the colonizers had generated conflict between and within indigenous nations that had reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the West. Furthermore, the HBC ran the fur trade in a notoriously tyrannical and colonial manner. For instance, indigenous trappers were paid significantly less for furs than white trappers, and they were forbidden from trading furs among themselves or even retaining furs for their personal use. HBC clerks would break into indigenous homes, seizing furs they found and punishing their bearers. Nevertheless, indigenous people still lived, by and large, in their communities and within the dynamic cultural traditions of their ancestors. And they were doing so on land increasingly coveted by the European settlers. As competition between the settler projects of Canada and the United States grew, plans for Canadian Confederation developed rapidly, and in turn, pressure on the Indigenous peoples of the West increased. (1867), the birth of Canada. In the debates that led to the British North America Act, George Brown gushed at the sweeping away of hostilities between a people comprised of two different races, speaking different languages, with religious and social and municipal and educational institutions totally different. He was referring not to the indigenous people, but to the English and French settlers. Indeed, much of the discussion surrounding Confederation in 1867, as in 2017, was about the union of Canada's French and English settlers into one state. Indigenous nations featured minimally in the discussions at the time, and indeed are barely mentioned in this story of 1867 in most Canadian history textbooks. But the absence of discussion of Indigenous peoples is, itself, arguably the central story of Confederation. The flowery speeches given by the so-called Fathers of Confederation about their magnanimous decision to set aside their differences to build this new dominion reflect the remarkable air of self-satisfaction that hung over a gathering of settlers effectively announcing their intention to complete the conquest of this land. Canadian nationalist historians often celebrate the settling of the West and the construction of the Intercontinental Railroad by pointing to the very real threat of U.S. annexation of that territory. This plays well for Canadian audiences that like the idea of standing up to the Yankees, but it misses a very important point. Neither Canada nor the United States had a legitimate claim to this land. The Confederators did not mention the Indigenous peoples precisely because the land they coveted was Indigenous territory. Elbows up. Elbows up. We got land to steal. Indeed, when Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, set out to purchase the Northwest from HBC, he was asked whether there would be any consultation with the Indigenous people living there. He replied that they were, quote, incapable of the management of their own affairs. His Minister of Public Works, William McDougall, added that this purchase would allow, quote, the whole expanse from the Atlantic to the Pacific to be peopled with a race the same as ourselves. In private correspondence, MacDonald assured a colleague that in another year, the present residents will be altogether swamped by the influx of strangers who will go in with the idea of becoming industrious, peaceable settlers. Yep. MacDonald's intentions and ideology are clear. Without consulting the nations that lived on the prairies, whom he deemed ignorant and lazy, he would purchase their land and flood it with more desirable settlers. It is worth noting that John A. Macdonald was an avowed white supremacist, and while this was not uncommon among wealthy white people in the late 19th century, he was a noteworthy racist even among his peers. He was among the pre-Confederation Canadians whose wealth was at least partially down to the slave trade, having married into Jamaican slave plantation money through his second wife. He did not hesitate to extol the virtues of the Aryan race, and he was fond of comparing other races to animals. If the Canadian elite were divided on whether Indigenous people should be assimilated or exterminated, MacDonald gives us a clue to his position when he says, quote, the Aryan races will not wholesomely amalgamate with the Africans or the Asiatics. The cross of those races, like the cross of the dog and the fox, is not successful. It cannot be, and never will be. Canada must protect the Aryan character of the future of British America. To MacDonald's surprise, the people living in the territory he had just purchased were not ready to embrace his flood of Aryan settlers. When surveyors were sent to the Red River colony to prepare the colony for a wave of immigration, the largely Métis population of the colony intercepted them and made clear that they were not welcome. The Métis had already dealt with incursions into their territory in the past. The John A. Macdonald experience, yeah. The Métis had already dealt with incursions into their territory in the past. Some 50 years earlier, they had their land purchased by the Earl of Selkirk, who was determined to settle it with Scottish immigrants. Selkirk's forces were defeated by the Métis at the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, an important assertion of the growing sense of Métis identity. In 1869, the Métis were no less determined to protect the territory of which they had lived for centuries. Though they possessed no paper to claim it, the Métis, descendants of mixed European and Indigenous families, had occupied the area around the Red River settlement since the early days of the fur trade. By the 1860s, they had considered themselves an independent nation and declared as much to the Canadians who arrived to assert their authority after Confederation. The Métis had typically elected councils of captains each year for the buffalo hunt and had effectively run their affairs based on this structure. Facing the threat of occupation by Canada, they formed a national committee along the same lines, seized the former HBC Fort Garry, and reached out to English settlers who had already lived in the colony to allow them to participate in its governance. While the Métis, under the leadership of Louis Riel, consolidated their autonomous government, Canadian officials continued to work towards the racial purification of the West, declaring that one day it would be populated by, quote, an energetic and civilized race able to improve its vast capabilities and appreciate its marvelous beauties. To that end, Canada's appointed governor, William McDougall, proposed that the solution was to put out a call for European settlers and provide them with arms. But when McDougall attempted to foment an uprising in the colony to undermine the Métis provisional government, it failed. Led by white supremacist Orangemen, it was quickly defeated and actually strengthened Métis commitment to their independence. John A. Macdonald urgently wanted to defeat the Métis, but needed to stall for time until a wave of settlement could be organized. Macdonald was wary of another attempt to unseat the provisional government by force because it had developed relationships with the U.S. state of Minnesota and would consider making a deal with the U.S. for its protection. He thus dispatched Donald A. Smith, an HBC commissioner turned Canadian Pacific Railway investor, to try to bribe the Métis and, when that failed, to negotiate a deal. Smith appeared accommodating to many of the Métis' demands, offering affirmative but non-committal answers to the most important demands around autonomy and land tenure. But Canada had no intention of keeping Smith's word. It promptly passed the Manitoba Act, creating the new province around the Red River settlement, while sending a military force of 1,200 soldiers to occupy it and ensure that Riel's provisional government was supplanted by the new apparatus of Manitoba. In a fitting prelude to the next 150 years of Canadian foreign policy, Colonel Garnet Wolseley's campaign to crush the autonomous Métis Nation was called a mission of peace. Though Riel and his associates were not fooled, they were not equipped to defeat a military force that was so clearly designed for conquest. Indeed, the body of work Wolseley himself spoke to the colonizing nature of the campaign. He had previously served in India, crushing the 1857 mutiny, and would later make war in Africa on behalf of Empire's West African colonies. The army he brought to Winnipeg consisted of 400 British soldiers and several hundred Ontario Orangemen, who subsequently inflicted a reign of terror on the Métis, fueled, according to one historian, by rage and alcohol. Many of the Métis were subjected to violence, sexual violence, and murder. That Louis Riel is remembered in much official history as the founder of Manitoba is a rather cheeky bit of misdirection. The founding of Manitoba was designed to eliminate Métis power and presence in Red River. Canada not only reneged on its promise to protect Métis land tenure, it also sent a force of belligerent racists to violently evict them from their lands. Most of the Métis abandoned Winnipeg and traveled west to follow the buffalo hunt, many settling near Batoche on the South Saskatchewan River. They quickly found themselves facing the same crises that plagued many of the Indigenous peoples in the Northwest: the disappearance of the buffalo and the encroachment of European settlement. As Canada tightened the noose in 1870s and 1880s, the Métis would make a last stand in the War of 1885, but by that point Canada was well on its way to conquering the West. Chat, I'm just going to be right back. I'm going to grab a drink and we'll be right back and continue reading. Just give me 1 second. Howdy, chat. Let's continue. Clearing the plains. The violent destruction of the provisional government of the Métis was the opening salvo in the process of settling the West. Over the 2 decades after Confederation, Canada would use manipulation, starvation, and violence to clear the Great Plains of its indigenous inhabitants, so as to make space for a wave of European settlement that would follow the construction of the Intercontinental Railroad. Indigenous dominion over the plains had already seen significant disruption prior to the 1860s. During the era of the fur trade, European diseases, especially smallpox, had ravaged the prairies and caused major dislocations. Nationalities themselves changed as entire cultural groups like the Basquiat Cree disappeared and their survivors integrated into other nations. Indigenous nations displaced by the French and English settlement, like the Haudenosaunee and Odawa, moved west and occupied territory left by those suffering from the losses to disease. All the while, the changing economic and political dynamics of the region, especially as they reoriented around trade with Europeans, generated conflict between nations that had previously enjoyed warm relations. The Aninin, for instance, refused to hunt beaver out of respect for long-standing traditions, but this made their territory valuable to other groups seeking to trade beaver pelts. This, as well as the Aninins' abundance in horses for equestrian hunting, made them targets for Cree raids. Nevertheless, even the significant changes in the 18th century could not compare to the catastrophe that would hit in the 19th century, when settlers' goals shifted from commerce to capitalism. Through the middle of the century, from the 1820s to the 1860s, the HBC was granted a monopoly over the fur trade and tried to exercise its power over the entire area known as Rupert's Land. It was hampered in that regard by its commercial core, seeking maximum returns on minimal investment. The HBC tried to run a lean organization, relying on indigenous suppliers to do most of the labor and counting on its ability to dictate advantageous terms of trade. As a result, the HBC was unable to assert dominance over the territory, which remained largely controlled by indigenous nations. In the first half of the 19th century, many indigenous nations were still able to thrive in societies that had been altered, but not completely undermined by European relations. According to James Dashik, studies of skeletons have shown that in the mid-19th century, peoples of the plains were perhaps the tallest and best nourished population in the world, as a result of the nutrient-rich diet centered around the buffalo hunt. Only a few decades later, these same people would be starving on reserves. By the 1860s and 1870s, the pressures of growing European settlement on the Red River were changing the game significantly. Arthur J. Ray argues, this new breed of settler dreamed of turning the prairies and parklands into wheat fields, but their dream was incompatible with the traditional land use practices of the native groups, which required large open areas for buffalo hunting and extensive common grazing and hayfields behind their Red River lots. In addition to the influx of these new settlers, the increased presence of American traders and miners moving north from Montana and declines in animal stock from overhunting were leading to conflict on the plains. Violent wars against indigenous peoples in the US was adding to this pressure, sending more refugees north, and the result was increasing food scarcity and epidemics of scarlet fever, smallpox, and especially tuberculosis stemming from malnutrition. Hunger, caused by the steadily increasing pressures of the 3 centuries of European colonization, was emerging as the greatest enemy of indigenous life. This problem reached its catastrophic height in the period immediately following Confederation, and Canada took full advantage of the situation. Between 1871 and 1877, Canada signed 7 key treaties with the Indigenous peoples of the West, sometimes called the Number Treaties, which Canada used to effectively claim dominion over the entire territory of what was once Rupert's Land. To be clear, many Indigenous leaders initially wanted to sign these treaties. Their societies were suddenly faced with rapid decline in the context of food scarcity, disease, and the influx of European settlers after the crushing of the Métis at Red River. It was believed by some that the treaty process could salvage a just peace between Indigenous and settler societies, involving appropriate and equitable stewardship of the land and, notably, guarantees of food and medicine from Canada in exchange for settlers' right to use Indigenous lands. Instead, the treaty process was used by Canada to press its advantage in a time of Indigenous crisis. It is hardly surprising, given the history of Indigenous settler relations and the imperatives of the new Canadian state, that the treaties were often struck in bad faith. Many careful studies of the treaty process suggest that Canadian authorities regularly penned written versions of the treaties that either changed or broke the spirit of the oral agreements. Scott Rutherford explains, significant disagreement remains regarding the terms agreed to in the number treaties, especially the word seed. Instead of interpreting seed to mean the sharing of non-reserved land for mutual hunting and gathering activities, the Canadian state interpreted it as the total surrender of land in exchange for parcels of land called reserves. Rather than being accidental misinterpretations, such changes always favored the Canadian government. The written version of Treaty Number 1, signed by the Saulteaux and Cree leaders in 1871, reportedly leaves out several clauses regarding the size of reserved lands, promises of hunting rights, and promises of assistance that would have benefited local Indigenous communities. This is significant in several respects, not the least of which is the fact that Canada's first foreign treaties were based in deception. What is more, it illustrates something critically important for contemporary discussions around Indigenous peoples in Canadian society. Canada gained much of its present territory based on agreements it never fulfilled. My own ancestors bought farmland in southern Manitoba in the 1880s from a Canadian state that had broken the terms of Treaty Number 1 and seized it from Indigenous peoples without carrying out its own obligations. This, alone, calls into question any legal right my family had to settle in Manitoba. And this was not the only problem with the treaties. In addition to manipulating the terms of the treaties themselves, Canada went to great lengths to ensure that it was bargaining from a position of power. This is clear in contrasting Treaty Number 1, 1871, with the later Treaty Number 6, 1876. The former relied on a sneaky interpretation of the meaning of seed, whereas the latter was negotiated during a time of Indigenous crisis and therefore made its terms cruelly clear. All Indians do hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the government forever all their rights, titles, and privileges whatsoever to the lands included. These are not terms of an agreement, they are terms of surrender. Indeed, treaty negotiations often took place in the shadow of Indigenous people's starvation and death from tuberculosis caused by malnutrition. Broadly speaking, this crisis was a result of colonialism, with its most immediate and visible manifestation being the disappearance of the buffalo, around which the plains economy was built. Pressure on the herds was primarily a consequence of overhunting, as more and more Indigenous peoples were pushed into the West by encroaching European settlement. This problem was exacerbated by the introduction of settler cattle ranching, which took grazing territory away from the buffalo, and also by the campaign of systematic slaughter of buffalo in the US. While there is little evidence that Canadian authorities or settlers did the same, it is likely that some of the buffalo in Canada migrated south to graze on lands vacated by the slaughtered herds there, and some historians have speculated that the Northwest Mounted Police, NWMP, may have deliberately driven some of the herds into the US to increase pressure on Indigenous peoples in Canada. After a winter without snow in 1878, fires ravaged the grasslands and the herds collapsed forever. The end of the buffalo hunt was the end of life as Indigenous peoples on the plains had known it. Treaties were increasingly signed in desperation, and with emphasis on insisting that the Canadian government provide seeds and implements to convert to agriculture economies and guarantees of food aid during crises. The Canadian government routinely failed to live up to its commitments, especially in later treaties. And as Indigenous communities starved and died of tuberculosis, Canada refused to provide aid unless and until people moved to reserves. Despite promises that Canada would help Indigenous people transition into agriculture, the reserves were located on sandy, rocky, or hilly territory that was typically poor farmland. By the 1880s, Indigenous life on the plains was utterly collapsing, with entire communities dying of hunger, even as settlers' cattle grazed on the land. The crisis on the plains in the late 1870s and early 1880s is described in harrowing detail in James Dashak's Clearing the Plains, 2013. What is most striking in this account is the extent to which the Canadian authorities both created the conditions. Yeah. What is most striking in this account is the extent to which the Canadian authorities both created the conditions for the catastrophe and then consciously refused to resolve it, letting thousands of Indigenous people die. As noted at the top of this chapter, Canadian leaders expressly proposed to give only enough food to keep them alive, and even then absolve themselves if any should starve. When Indigenous people flooded into the settler fort of Battleford demanding rations, Canadian authorities refused and instead gave food to settler laborers as payment for building a stockade to protect the fort from Indigenous raids. One obvious illustration of the coordinated famine on the prairies was the fact that Indigenous people were dying from protein deficiency alongside grazing cattle. Some of the ranchers, concerned about the prospect of having their cattle poached, but perhaps also motivated by some humanitarian impulse, offered to sell their lands to the government to give to the starving Indigenous people, but Indian Commissioner Edgar Dewdney declined. Dewdney may have been loath to harm the cattle industry since he had a stake in the success of I.G. Baker and Company, the largest meat contractor in Canada at the time. Don't forget, lunatics gone bug-eyed and drooling with fanatical capitalist hatred. Yeah. Canadian officials not only refused to adequately address the crisis, they actively took advantage of the situation. Many Indigenous nations were refused aid unless they signed treaties, which even some within the Canadian government described as a policy of submission shaped by a policy of starvation. By the early 1880s, as the Canadian government was building the Intercontinental Railroad and beginning the permanent European settlement of the West, it needed to clear the Indigenous peoples out of the way, so it began refusing food aid to anyone not already relocated to the reserves. When even that didn't work, Canada simply expelled them by force, as when 5,000 people were forced out of Cypress Hills in 1883. Even when Canada provided a little bit of relief, it was minimal, reluctant, and sometimes rotten. John A. Macdonald, in his second stint as Prime Minister, promised Parliament that he would not spend undue resources keeping Indigenous people alive. He said, "We are doing all we can by refusing food until the Indians are on the verge of starvation to reduce the expense. In some cases, the state would extract forced labor out of Indigenous people in exchange for food. Quote, they must work or starve," blustered the well-fed finance minister, Sir Leonard Tilley. His colleague, Lawrence Van Conant, reinforced that position with added colonial zest. Strict instructions have been given to the agents to require labor from able-bodied Indians for supplies given them. This principle was laid down for the sake of the moral effect that would have on the Indians in showing them that they must give something in return for what they receive, and also for the purpose of preventing them from hereafter expecting gratuitous assistance from the government. That's really fucking funny given the fact that every fucking white person in in Canada at this time was given Indigenous land for fucking free. Thus, Canadian officials waxed poetic about teaching Indigenous people about fair exchange in the midst of Canada's ethnic cleansing of Indigenous people by a combination of violence, deception, and deliberate starvation. Van Conet's concern that Indigenous people might expect gratuitous assistance reflected the fact that they did, in fact, demand that Canada abide by the terms it had signed in the treaties, which specifically included food aid, medicine, and assistance in establishing new farmlands on the reserves they had been confined to. It was Canada that was, quite literally, failing to give something in return for what it received, the support it had promised in exchange for the land it had claimed.